They said she was just another scared country girl who would break in 3 days. Jolene Faith was about to prove them all wrong in ways they never saw coming. Prison walls had seen many fighters, but none like the quiet 17-year-old from Alabama, who carried her grandmother's wisdom in her heart and fire in her soul. When the biggest bully in Riverside Correctional met Jolene that first day, he thought he found easy prey, but what happened next would shake the entire prison system and change lives forever. This is the story of how one small-town girl became the most respected person behind bars and turned enemies into family through the power of heart strength and one unforgettable moment that nobody saw coming. Jolene stepped off the prison transport bus with her head held high, even though her hands shook like autumn leaves. The concrete walls of Riverside Correctional towered above her like gray mountains, and the razor wire caught sunlight like broken glass. She clutched the small wooden cross her grandmother gave her and whispered, a prayer her mama taught her back in their tiny house in rural Alabama. Other inmates watched through barred windows as guards marched her across the yard, and Jolene felt their eyes burning into her soul. She was 17 years old, sentenced to 2 years for defending her little brother from drug dealers who tried to recruit him, and now she faced the hardest challenge of her young life. The other girls had warned her that prison was different than county jail, and Jolene knew she needed to be stronger than she ever imagined possible. The first person Jolene met was Officer Rodriguez, a kind woman with tired eyes who showed her to the cell block. "Keep your head down and stay out of trouble," Officer Rodriguez whispered as they walked down the long hallway filled with the sounds of shouting television shows and slamming doors. Jolene nodded, but inside she felt her grandmother's voice telling her to never bow down to bullies no matter how big they were. Her cell was small, with 2 narrow beds and a tiny window that showed a slice of sky, and Jolene sat on her assigned bottom bunk, wondering how her mama was doing back home without her. The top bunk belonged to Carmen, a tough-looking woman with scars on her arms, who barely looked up when Jolene introduced herself politely. "Just stay quiet, little girl," Carmen muttered, rolling over to face the wall, and Jolene understood that making friends here would not be easy. The next morning, Jolene learned about Jake Morrison, the man who ran the prison like his personal kingdom. Jake was 6 feet tall, with arms covered in tattoos, and a reputation for breaking new inmates who did not show him proper respect. He controlled everything from who got the best jobs to who received protection from other dangerous prisoners, and even some guards looked the other way when Jake flexed his power. Jolene first saw him during breakfast, when the entire cafeteria went quiet as he walked between the tables collecting what other inmates called tribute money or food or whatever else Jake wanted from them. His cold blue eyes scanned the room like a predator looking for weakness, and when those eyes landed on Jolene sitting alone with her small portion of eggs and toast, she felt ice water run through her veins. "Well, well, well," Jake said, walking over to Jolene's table with 3 of his followers behind him like hungry wolves. "What do we have here, folks? A little country mouse who thinks she can eat in my cafeteria without paying the welcome tax." His voice was smooth but deadly, like a snake preparing to strike, and Jolene felt every person in that room watching to see what would happen next. She looked up at Jake with steady brown eyes that showed no fear, even though her heart was beating like a drum in her chest. "I don't have any money to give you, sir," Jolene said quietly but clearly, and several inmates gasped because nobody ever refused Jake Morrison anything. Jake's face turned red with anger, and he slammed his fist on the table, making Jolene's plastic tray jump, but she did not flinch or look away from his burning stare. "Listen here, little girl," Jake growled, leaning down until his face was inches from Jolene's, and she could smell his sour breath. "Every new fish pays me, or they learn the hard way that I run this place, and you look like you need some education." His followers laughed like hyenas, but Jolene just sat there calm as still water, remembering her grandmother's words about how bullies were usually the most scared people of all. "My grandmother always said that respect is earned, not taken," Jolene replied in her soft Alabama accent, and Jake's eyes flashed with rage because he was not used to anyone talking back to him, especially not a skinny 17-year-old girl from some nowhere town. The tension in that cafeteria was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and Jolene knew that this moment would decide how the rest of her time in prison would go. Jake grabbed Jolene's arm and yanked her up from the bench, but instead of crying out or begging for mercy like he expected, Jolene just looked at him with those steady eyes that seemed to see right through his tough guy act too, the broken person underneath. "You made a big mistake, girl," Jake snarled, dragging her toward the door while his followers hooted and cheered. But Jolene noticed that some of the older inmates were shaking their heads sadly, like they had seen this scene too many times before. Officer Rodriguez was nowhere to be seen, and Jolene realized she was completely on her own, facing the biggest bully she had ever encountered. But as Jake pulled her into the empty corridor, Jolene felt something strange happening inside her chest, not fear, but a growing warmth that reminded her of sitting in her grandmother's kitchen learning about the strength that runs in the blood of strong women. "Please let me go," Jolene said, not because she was begging, but because she wanted to give Jake one last chance to do the right thing. Jake just laughed and pushed her against the cold concrete wall, but what he did not know was that Jolene had grown up on a farm where she wrestled cattle and chopped wood, and carried her disabled grandfather up and down stairs every day for years. Her small body was filled with the kind of strength that comes from hard work and deep roots, and when Jake reached out to grab her again, Jolene was ready. In one smooth motion that her grandfather had taught her for dealing with aggressive bulls, Jolene stepped sideways, grabbed Jake's wrist, and used his own momentum to flip him over her shoulder in a perfect judo throw that sent the 200-pound man crashing to the floor so hard the impact echoed through the hallway like thunder. Jake lay on the cold linoleum, gasping for air, with his eyes wide with shock because nobody had ever put him on his back before, and he could not believe that this small country girl had just thrown him like he weighed nothing. Jolene stood over him, breathing hard, but not from fear, but from the rush of finally standing up to someone who used their size to hurt smaller people. "My grandfather taught me that move for dealing with bulls back home," Jolene said, looking down at Jake, who was struggling to get his breath back. "He always said that the biggest bulls fall the hardest when you know where to push." The hallway was silent except for Jake's heavy breathing, and Jolene realized that everything in her life had changed in those few seconds because word would spread fast about what just happened. But instead of walking away or celebrating her victory, Jolene did something that nobody expected, not even herself. She reached down and offered her hand to help Jake get back on his feet, because her grandmother always taught her that showing mercy was stronger than showing force. Jake stared at her extended hand like it was a snake ready to bite him, and Jolene could see confusion replacing the anger in his blue eyes. "Why?" Jake whispered, still lying on the floor, and Jolene smiled the same gentle smile she gave to scared animals on her family's farm. "Because everybody deserves a second chance," Jolene replied, and after a long moment, Jake took her hand and let her pull him up, even though he could have easily gotten up by himself. Standing face to face in that empty hallway, Jake Morrison looked at Jolene Faith with new eyes, and for the first time in years, someone saw past his tough exterior to the scared boy inside who had built walls around his heart to survive. "Nobody ever helped me up before," Jake said quietly, and Jolene could hear the pain in his voice that he usually hid behind anger and threats. "Well, now somebody has," Jolene replied, and something magical happened in that moment, as two people who should have been enemies found a connection that neither of them expected. Jake's followers had disappeared when the fight started because they were only brave when their leader was winning, but now Jake stood alone with a girl who had beaten him and then shown him kindness, and he did not know what to do with feelings he thought he had forgotten. From that day forward, everything changed at Riverside Correctional, because Jolene had done something nobody thought was Possible she had defeated the biggest bully without destroying him. Instead of ruling through fear like Jake had done, Jolene began building something new based on respect and mutual support. She started small by sharing her meals with inmates who had nothing and helping older prisoners write letters to their families and teaching younger inmates how to read better so they could get their GED certificates. Jake watched from a distance at first, trying to understand this strange girl who had turned his world upside down with one perfect throw and one act of kindness that had melted the ice around his heart after so many years of cold loneliness. The other inmates noticed the change too, because Jake stopped collecting tribute and started protecting weaker prisoners from other bullies instead of being the biggest threat himself. Carmen, Jolene's cellmate, was the first to ask what kind of magic Jolene had worked on the meanest man in the prison. "No magic," Jolene replied while brushing her hair before bed. "Just treated him like a human being instead of a monster, and sometimes that is all. People need to remember who they really are underneath all the hurt." Carmen stared at her young cellmate with amazement, because in all her years behind bars, she had never seen anyone transform hatred into something beautiful the way Jolene had done. The transformation was not just in Jake, but throughout the entire prison, as Jolene's influence spread like ripples on a calm pond. She organized a book club that brought together inmates from different racial groups who had never spoken to each other before, and she convinced the warden to let them start a vegetable garden where prisoners could learn farming skills while growing fresh food for the cafeteria. Jolene wrote letters for inmates who could not write well, and she mediated disputes between cellmates who were ready to fight over small things, because she understood that most prison conflicts started from deeper pain and frustration. Even the guards began to notice that their jobs were easier because there were fewer fights and less tension when Jolene was around to calm situations with her gentle wisdom and unshakable inner strength. Jake became Jolene's closest ally in creating positive changes, because he realized that his reputation and connections could be used to help people instead of hurting them. Together, they convinced the warden to expand the GED program and bring in counselors to help inmates deal with addiction and trauma, and Jake used his influence to make sure that weaker prisoners were protected from exploitation. "You changed my life," Jake told Jolene one day while they worked side by side in the prison garden, pulling weeds from around tomato plants. "You changed your own life," Jolene replied, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her dirty glove. "I just showed you that you had the power to choose who you wanted to be, and you chose to be someone better." Jolene's mother visited every month, driving 4 hours each way from their small Alabama town to see her daughter, and she was amazed by the stories Jolene told about the friendships and positive changes happening behind prison walls. "Baby girl, you are doing something special in there," her mother said during one visit while they sat across from each other at a small table in the visiting room. "Grandmother always said you had the gift of seeing the good in people, even when they could not see it themselves." Jolene smiled and squeezed her mother's hands, feeling grateful for the strong women who had raised her to believe that love was more powerful than fear, and that every person deserved a chance at redemption, no matter what mistakes they had made. The day Jolene was released after serving 18 months of her 2-year sentence, the entire prison seemed different than the place she had entered as a scared 17-year-old girl. Inmates lined up to say goodbye, and many of them cried because Jolene had become like a sister or daughter or friend to people who had forgotten what real family felt like. Jake shook her hand with tears in his eyes because Jolene had given him something more valuable than power or respect. She had given him hope that he could be a better man. "I will never forget what you taught me," Jake said, and Jolene hugged him tight because she knew that the scared boy inside the tough exterior would always be part of her prison family. Officer Rodriguez walked Jolene to the front gate, carrying a small bag with her few possessions and a folder full of letters from inmates thanking her for bringing light into the darkest place in their lives. "You did something incredible here, Jolene," Officer Rodriguez said as they stood before the heavy metal door that separated prison from freedom. "These men and women will carry the lessons you taught them for the rest of their lives, and some of them will stay out of trouble because of you." Jolene looked back at the gray concrete buildings one last time and smiled because she knew that her grandmother had been right when she said that the strongest people are not those who never fall down, but those who help others stand up. Jolene walked out of Riverside Correctional into the Alabama sunshine where her mother waited in their old pickup truck with tears of joy streaming down her face. As they drove away, Jolene rolled down the window and felt the wind in her hair while thinking about all the people she was leaving behind who had become her family during the hardest time of her life. She had entered prison as a scared country girl, but she was leaving as a young woman who understood that real strength comes not from fighting, but from healing, and that the most powerful thing anyone can do is show compassion to someone who does not expect it. The little wooden cross her grandmother gave her still hung around her neck, and Jolene whispered a prayer of gratitude for the chance to learn that even in the darkest places love can bloom if someone is brave enough to plant the first seed of kindness in hard ground. 3 months after Jolene helped Jake up from that cold prison floor, something happened that tested everything she had built at Riverside Correctional. A new inmate arrived named Tommy Rodriguez, a 25-year-old gang member from Detroit who had heard stories about the country girl who had supposedly tamed the legendary Jake Morrison. Tommy came to prison with a reputation for extreme violence and a chip on his shoulder the size of Texas because he believed that showing any weakness would get him killed. He looked at Jolene's peaceful approach to prison life as weakness and decided that he needed to prove himself by taking down both Jolene and Jake to establish his own dominance. Tommy started spreading poison through the prison, telling other inmates that Jolene was just a little girl playing games and that Jake had gone soft like an old man who lost his edge. The tension began building during Jolene's book club meeting when Tommy walked in uninvited and started mocking the inmates who were discussing a story about forgiveness and second chances. "This is pathetic," Tommy announced loudly, causing everyone to look up from their books in surprise. "You all sitting here like school children listening to fairy tales while the real world is about survival of the strongest." Jolene felt her heart racing, but she kept her voice calm and steady as she responded to Tommy's challenge. "Everyone is welcome here, Tommy, but we ask that people respect others who are trying to learn and grow," she said, with the same gentle firmness she had used with aggressive animals on her family farm. Tommy laughed harshly and knocked Jolene's book off the table, sending it sliding across the floor and creating a moment of dangerous silence that made everyone hold their breath. Jake started to rise from his chair with fire in his eyes because nobody disrespected Jolene in his presence, but Jolene caught his eye and shook her head slightly, knowing that violence would only prove Tommy's point about strength being the only thing that mattered. Instead, Jolene calmly picked up her book and looked directly at Tommy with those steady brown eyes that had seen through so many tough exteriors to the pain underneath. "I understand you are new here and probably scared about how you will survive," Jolene said quietly but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Fear makes people act in ways they would not normally act, and I have been scared too, so I know how it feels." Tommy's face turned red with rage because being called scared in front of other inmates was the worst insult anyone could deliver in prison culture. "You calling me scared, little girl?" Tommy snarled, stepping closer to Jolene while clenching his fists, and several inmates moved their chairs back, anticipating an explosion of violence. Jolene stood up slowly and faced Tommy without backing down, even though he was much bigger and had arms covered with tattoos showing his gang affiliations and violent history. "I am saying that we are all scared sometimes, and that is okay, because being brave does not mean not being afraid. It means doing the right thing even when you are afraid," Jolene replied, and her words seemed to hang in the air like music because even Tommy had never heard anyone talk about fear and courage in such a simple, honest way. The other inmates watched this confrontation with fascination because they were seeing two completely different philosophies about prison life and human nature colliding in real time. Tommy raised his hand as if to strike Jolene, but something in her eyes stopped him, because she was not looking at him with fear or hatred, but with the same compassion she showed to everyone who was hurting inside. My grandfather used to say that the angriest bulls are usually the ones who have been hurt the most, Jolene said softly, and Tommy's hand began to shake because her words reminded him of his own grandfather who had tried to keep him out of gangs before drugs and violence destroyed their neighborhood. For just a moment, Tommy's tough mask slipped, and Jolene saw the frightened boy who had joined a gang for protection and ended up in prison for crimes he committed while trying to prove he was not weak. But then Tommy's training kicked in, and he pushed down those feelings because showing vulnerability in his world meant death or worse. The confrontation might have ended differently, but at that exact moment, the prison alarm started blaring and guards rushed into the room shouting orders for everyone to return to their cells immediately. A fight had broken out in another part of the prison, and the facility was going into lockdown, which meant that Jolene and Tommy's showdown would have to wait. As they filed out of the room, Tommy whispered to Jolene, "This is not over, country girl. You and your boyfriend Jake better watch your backs, because I am going to show this prison who really runs things around here." Jolene nodded sadly because she could see that Tommy was trapped in a cycle of violence that he did not know how to escape, and she wondered if there was any way to reach him before someone got seriously hurt. During the 3-day lockdown that followed, Jolene lay on her narrow bunk thinking about Tommy and remembering her own first days in prison when fear had made her want to build walls around her heart for protection. Carmen, her cellmate, had been watching the situation develop, and she finally spoke up about what everyone was thinking. "That Tommy is trouble, Jolene, and he is not going to stop until he proves himself by hurting you or Jake or both," Carmen said while staring at the ceiling of their small cell. "I have seen his type before, and they only understand violence, so maybe you need to fight fire with fire this time." Jolene understood Carmen's concern, but her grandmother's voice in her head kept reminding her that fighting hatred with hatred only creates more darkness in the world. When the lockdown ended, Jolene discovered that Tommy had been busy recruiting followers among the newer inmates who had not experienced the positive changes she and Jake had brought to Riverside Correctional. These men were angry and desperate, and they saw Tommy's message of strength through violence as their only hope for survival in a system that seemed designed to crush their spirits. Tommy had convinced them that Jolene's approach was naive and dangerous because it made them vulnerable to exploitation by stronger predators who would see kindness as weakness. Jolene realized that she was facing her biggest challenge, yet because Tommy was not just one angry man but the leader of a growing movement that threatened to undo months of progress toward making the prison a more humane place. The crisis came to a head during dinner when Tommy and 6 of his followers surrounded Jolene's table while Jake was across the cafeteria getting seconds of the vegetable stew that had become popular since Jolene started the garden program. Tommy slammed his tray down on Jolene's table and leaned over her with a cruel smile that made several nearby inmates stop eating and prepare for violence. "Time for your final lesson, country girl," Tommy announced loudly enough for half the cafeteria to hear. "You have been playing house in here long enough, and now it is time for you to learn how the real world works." Jolene felt her heart pounding, but she also felt the strength of all the people who believed in her approach flowing through her veins like warm honey. "Tommy, please sit down and let us talk about whatever is bothering you," Jolene said in her calmest voice while gesturing to an empty chair at her table. "There is room for everyone here, and no reason we cannot work together to make this place better for all of us." But Tommy was beyond reason because he had spent too many years believing that violence was the only language that mattered, and Jolene's continued kindness felt like mockery to him. "The only thing I want to hear from you is screaming," Tommy growled, reaching across the table to grab Jolene's shirt. But before he could touch her, something unexpected happened that changed everything once again in ways that nobody could have predicted. Jake had seen what was happening from across the cafeteria, and he started moving toward Jolene's table, but he was not the first person to reach her. Carmen had been sitting at a nearby table, and she stood up with fire in her eyes because Jolene had become like a little sister to her over the past months. "Get your hands off her," Carmen shouted, stepping between Tommy and Jolene with her own fists clenched and ready for battle. But Carmen was not alone, because suddenly inmates from all over the cafeteria were standing up and moving toward Jolene's table, not to join Tommy's attack, but to protect the girl who had brought hope and healing to their broken lives. Tommy looked around in shock as he realized that Jolene had something he could never understand or defeat through violence. She had earned the genuine love and respect of people who had forgotten how to trust anyone, and they were willing to risk everything to protect her because she had shown them that they were worth protecting too. Old men who had been in prison for decades stood shoulder to shoulder with young gang members who had learned to read in Jolene's literacy program, and former enemies who had found common ground through her mediation stood united for the first time in their lives. Tommy's 6 followers began backing away because they suddenly understood that they were outnumbered, not by people who wanted to fight, but by people who had found something worth defending. "This is what real strength looks like, Tommy," Jolene said, standing up and facing him with tears in her eyes, not from fear, but from overwhelming gratitude for the family that had formed around her in the most unlikely place. "It is not about being the biggest or the toughest or the meanest. It is about being someone that others can count on when life gets hard." Tommy stared at the crowd of inmates who had surrounded Jolene like a protective wall, and for the first time in his adult life he felt truly alone, because he had spent so many years pushing people away that he had forgotten how to let anyone get close to him. The standoff might have continued, but Jake finally arrived, and instead of adding to the tension, he did something that surprised everyone, including Jolene. He walked straight up to Tommy and extended his hand in greeting, like they were meeting for the first time. "I heard you are new here and having a hard time adjusting," Jake said, with genuine concern in his voice. "I remember what that feels like, because I was angry and scared when I first got here too, until someone showed me that there was a better way to live." Tommy stared at Jake's outstretched hand like it was a foreign object, because he had expected to be challenged to a fight, not offered friendship by the man he had planned to defeat. The moment stretched on forever as everyone in that cafeteria held their breath, waiting to see what Tommy would do with this unexpected act of grace. Jolene watched Tommy's face and saw the same struggle she had witnessed in Jake's eyes months earlier, the battle between the hardened criminal who trusted no one and the lost human being who desperately wanted to believe that life could be different. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Tommy reached out and shook Jake's hand, and Jolene saw tears forming in the corner of his eyes as years of carefully constructed walls began to crumble around his heart. "I do not know how to be any different," Tommy whispered so quietly that only Jake and Jolene could hear him, and the raw pain in his voice made Jolene's heart break for this man who had been taught that violence was love and cruelty was strength. Jake nodded with understanding, because he remembered feeling the same hopelessness before Jolene had shown him that change was possible through small acts of courage and consistent kindness. "Neither did I, brother, but these people taught me that it is never too late to learn new ways of being strong," Jake replied, putting his arm around Tommy's shoulders and guiding him to sit down at Jolene's table, where there was always room for one more person who needed a family. Over the following weeks, Tommy slowly began to open up about his life story, and Jolene learned that he had grown up in a neighborhood where joining a gang was the only way to survive, and where showing weakness meant becoming a victim of even worse violence. His mother had worked 3 jobs trying to keep him in school, but the streets were stronger than her love, and Tommy had fallen into a world where respect came from fear and loyalty was enforced through brutality. Jolene listened without judgment as Tommy described the crimes that had brought him to prison, and she helped him understand that his past did not have to define his future if he was willing to make different choices starting today. The transformation was not easy because Tommy had to unlearn 25 years of survival strategies that had kept him alive but also isolated him from genuine human connection. There were setbacks and moments when his old anger flared up, but Jolene and Jake were patient with him, the way that good parents are patient with children who are learning to walk. They celebrated small victories, like when Tommy helped an elderly inmate reach something on a high shelf, or when he shared his dessert with someone who had been kind to him, and gradually Tommy began to experience the joy that comes from lifting others up instead of tearing them down. Jolene's influence continued to spread throughout Riverside Correctional as more inmates discovered that strength could be gentle and power could be used to heal rather than harm. The warden noticed that disciplinary incidents had dropped by 60% since Jolene's arrival, and medical staff reported fewer injuries from fights and fewer requests for protective custody from inmates who feared for their safety. The prison's recidivism rate began to improve as former inmates who had been part of Jolene's program stayed out of trouble after their release because they had learned skills and formed relationships that helped them build new lives in the outside world. News of the changes at Riverside Correctional began to attract attention from criminal justice reform advocates and researchers who wanted to study how one teenager had accomplished what decades of traditional punishment had failed to achieve. Jolene was interviewed by reporters and social workers who were amazed by her simple philosophy of treating every person with dignity and respect, regardless of their past mistakes. My grandmother always told me that everyone has light inside them, even when they forget how to let it shine. Jolene explained to a journalist who was writing a story about innovative approaches to rehabilitation. Sometimes all it takes is one person who believes in you to remember who you really are underneath all the hurt and anger. The day finally came when Jolene was scheduled for release, and the entire prison seemed to hold its breath because no one wanted to lose the person who had brought so much positive change to their lives. Inmates had been planning a farewell celebration for weeks, and they gathered in the cafeteria to present Jolene with gifts they had made in the woodworking and art therapy programs she had helped establish. Jake gave her a small wooden cross that he had carved to match the one her grandmother had given her, and Tommy presented her with a poem he had written about second chances and the power of forgiveness to heal old wounds. "You saved my life, Jolene," Tommy said through tears as he hugged the girl who had seen past his anger to the frightened boy inside who just wanted to belong somewhere safe. "You showed me that being strong means protecting people instead of hurting them, and I promise I will spend the rest of my time here helping other inmates the way you helped me." Jolene hugged him back and whispered, "You saved yourself, Tommy. I just reminded you that you had the power to choose who you wanted to be, and you chose to be someone beautiful." Officer Rodriguez walked Jolene to the front gate one final time, carrying letters from dozens of inmates who wanted to stay in touch and continue learning from her example even after she returned to the outside world. The vegetable garden that Jolene had started was blooming with tomatoes and beans and peppers that would feed the prison community through the summer and fall, and Jolene knew that the seeds she had planted in human hearts would continue growing long after she was gone. "This place will never be the same because of you," Officer Rodriguez said as they stood before the heavy metal door that separated prison from freedom. "You proved that rehabilitation is possible when it comes from the heart instead of just the head." Jolene walked out of Riverside Correctional for the second and final time into the Alabama sunshine, where her mother waited with tears of pride streaming down her face. As they drove away, Jolene looked back at the gray concrete buildings that had been her home for 18 months and smiled because she knew that she was leaving behind a community of people who had learned to see themselves and each other through new eyes. She had entered prison as a scared teenager who had made one desperate choice to protect her brother, but she was leaving as a young woman who understood that real change happens one heart at a time through the patient work of loving people back to life. Years later, Jolene became a counselor working with at-risk youth and former inmates, helping them find jobs and rebuild their lives, and she often told them the story about the day she met the biggest bully in prison and discovered that underneath every tough exterior is a human being who just wants to be loved and accepted. Jake stayed in touch and eventually became a mentor for new inmates, teaching them that violence never solves problems, but understanding and respect can transform enemies into friends. Tommy earned his GED while still in prison and started a program for gang members who wanted to leave that life behind, and he credited Jolene with showing him that true brotherhood comes from lifting each other up instead of tearing each other down. The vegetable garden Jolene started still grows at Riverside Correctional, and every year new inmates learn that they can nurture life even in a place designed to punish, and that sometimes the most important lessons come not from books but from a 17-year-old girl from rural Alabama who proved that the size of your heart matters more than the size of your fists, and that one act of courage mixed with compassion can change an entire world.